Welcome. This is Trinity Place, and my name is Cameron Miller, and this is a reflection for the first Sunday of Advent in 2022. So I'm going to invite you to picture this scene, if you will. Martin Luther King Jr. sits by himself in an anteroom with his head in his hands, knowing that assassins are prowling the perimeters of his life. Even so, he must go into that hot, steamy church filled cheek to jowl with other frightened, angry, and desperate faces seeking hope upon which to hang their lives. He already knows what it's like to be near death because he was stabbed and an attacker's knife with a blade just a sneeze away from rupturing his aorta. Death threats were a daily fare for him. And the FBI, that could be counted upon to protect a white minister, seemed as menacing as the ominous threats. But the crowds, they were getting bigger and bigger, and the agitation toward violence getting greater and greater. Surely he was looking down that dark tunnel, and it must have made it more difficult for him to preach. When finally he left the darkness within himself and stepped into that pulpit to preach that night, he didn't ask, why? Why? Instead, he fell back upon a solid wall he always leaned against in such dark moments. Isaiah. At least that's how I imagine it, because I also lean on Isaiah when the sky is gray and the light too thin to shine. At the Lincoln Monument, for example, King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech rang out with a resonance that eventually changed the nation. He preached those dreams riffing on Isaiah's vision. Then, the day before he was assassinated, King left the relative safety of Atlanta to help sanitation workers in Memphis. He did so against the dire warnings from colleagues. He did so to help sanitation workers because no one else was going to do it. What we know now, with the publication of his diaries and those of his family and his friends, is that he was terribly afraid. He awoke many a night in a sweat, knowing that at the dark edges of his life lurked a hatred that would kill him. Even so, at his last public appearance, the night before he died for us, as we say about Jesus, he preached Isaiah. He preached that mountaintop again, in a sermon that has no equal in the annals of American history except perhaps the Gettysburg Address. He said he would not get there with us, but that he had looked over the mountaintop and he had seen the promised land. And in the midst of darkness, Reverend King preached hope. He preached Isaiah. Isaiah that we read today in First Advent. So let's go back to Isaiah, the poet who fueled Martin Luther King Jr. and who burns like a candle still in the darkness across millennia and across lives, a light that has not been extinguished even now. Isaiah, you see, lived in a very hazardous time. The northern kingdom of Israel had already been annexed by the Assyrian Empire, and Judah, where Jerusalem was situated, had to pay tributes to the Assyrian emperor in order to keep from being crushed. And the king of Judah and the power elite of Jerusalem did whatever dark deed was required by the Assyrians in order to keep from being gobbled up by them. Through Isaiah's prophetic eyes, like the ones that Reverend King inherited, Isaiah could see more than the obvious which is the only thing that others around him saw. Indeed, he saw horrendous injustice in his society. He saw that the national and religious leaders lived a far distance from the values and spirituality they publicly espoused and that they said they cherished. He saw the deathly disparities in wealth and an economy based upon violence and war. He could even see the grim mayhem waving unseen by his colleagues on the horizon. It was a time not unlike our own. Isaiah foresaw a time of national disaster when everyone, from the highest religious leaders to the king and on down, would groan in despair. The question, why? Where is our God? They would groan. Now, Isaiah had no power with which to answer the injustices he saw. He had no answer for the fact that God, supposedly a God of mercy and justice, seemed negligent. He had no answer for what seemed like God's utter neglect of those who were most vulnerable and who had to miserably fend for themselves. He had no answer for why bad things happen to good people and why so many bad people seem to get away with so much bad. Isaiah had no answer for any of it. The prophet could see the present disaster that everybody else seemed blind to, or that everybody else seemed to deny. But even so, he had no answer for it. Isaiah could see the moment, but he could also see the other side of the moment. Like Reverend King, Isaiah could see what had brought them into that moment. And he could see both the moment and the light gilded edges on the other side of the mountaintop. But for what lay in between, Isaiah had no answer. Isaiah could only hold hope, a relentless hope. Even without an answer for what would come next, he held on to what we call trust, a stout, burly trust. The reason it requires trust is that we see too little to answer the why questions. In fact, we don't even know if there is an answer to the why questions. We see too little. We know too little. We think too small. In the absence of better knowledge, in the presence of such a severe gap between what we want to know and our answers, we can only trust, or make things up, or fantasize, or we can become cynical and angry. It's kind of a trinity of options: trust, pretend, become bitter. Trust, pretend or deny, or become bitter and cynical. To trust God means to make hope our default setting. To make hope our default setting the way that Isaiah and Martin Luther King did. It's the simplest of the three options: to put one foot in front of the other and keep walking toward the mountain. The season of Advent is this little trick that the church uses to remind us that we don't get to know the answers to the questions that most agitate us and that we most want to know. We don't get to know. We do not get to know why war persists. We don't get to know why human beings, with all the evidence to the contrary, continue to organize our economies and our societies around such self-defeating behaviors, greed and lust and coercion. We don't get to know when peace will arrive. We don't get to know if we will really ever truly do what it takes to minimize the climate change that's already happening. Only the following generations will get to know. We do not get to know answers to problems, dilemmas, and conflicts that make us crazy. We only get to know our own efforts to care for and to respect the dignity of other human beings. The most we can do is trust and hold hope. Trust and hold hope. You see, Advent, this little 4-week season before Christmas, Advent is an exercise in holding hope and practicing trust. Holding hope and practicing trust. We always live in the in-between. Always the in-between. While the most visionary among us may be able to see the edges of the future, we don't get to know it. But we do get to choose what will guide us through this in-between. Denial, bitterness, or trust. Welcome back to Advent and an exercise in practicing trust and holding hope. I wish you peace. Welcome to Advent.